Now, the compromise leaders in the Soviet may not have wanted the power, but the April days discussed in the previous video had once again shown that the real power in the capital lay not with the provisional government, but with the Soviet. But what was needed was a Soviet leadership prepared to take that power. Now, the lessons of the April events were absorbed by many workers and soldiers, but not so often by their Soviet delegates. For now, there was often a mismatch between the vote in the Soviet at the end of the April days and the changing views of the masses. Trotsky explains that even Soviet representation can lag behind the mood of the masses. It often takes major events like those of April to teach workers that their representative needs changing. And it took a little time for delegates to be reselected, although this was now a process that many workers and the Bolsheviks themselves were calling for. Meanwhile, the action of the masses had pushed the workers' leaders not to the left but further to the right. The Soviet EC united behind conservatives like the Menshevik Tsereteli, pushing more radical elements like Sukhanov to one side. In fact, the compromise between the Soviet EC and the bourgeoisie was now forced to take its next logical step, that of forming a coalition government. Because the Liberals now realised their position was too weak to rule without the direct participation of the Socialists. For weeks now, it had been clear in the provinces that the local Soviets were really in charge of events, not the government commissars. And the correlation of forces meant that the Socialists were being forced against their will to take control of administrations, fix prices, make investigations and arrests and so on. Now the provisional government's impotence had also been revealed in Petrograd itself. The bourgeoisie desperately needed the Soviet leaders to assume some direct responsibility for events, so as to deflect some of the criticism away from the government, and also so that they could hold back the workers. The Allied embassies also exerted pressure for a coalition government, hoping it would be able to call for an offensive on the Russian front. Such an attack would muddy the image of the revolution in the eyes of the British and French soldiers, who were looking to it as a hope for peace. And a delegation of Allied patriotic, again so-called socialists, was sent to Russia to help Toma in his treacherous work of convincing the Soviet of the need for war and an offensive. Nevertheless, a layer of Soviet leaders, particularly the Mensheviks, tried to resist the pressure for coalition. This was not, of course, through any principled opposition to alliances with the bourgeoisie, but because they rightly feared that it would make it easier for the masses to lose their illusions about the dual power. However, Trotsky explains that for now, those illusions were still there, and that, to quote him, the masses, insofar as they were not yet for the Bolsheviks, stood solid for the entrance of the socialists into the government. If it is a good thing to have Kerensky as a minister, then so much better, 6 Kerenskys. So the joint pressure of both the masses and the bourgeoisie forced the EC leaders, after some vacillation, to accept the Liberals' invitation to join a coalition government. On May the 1st, the EC voted in favour of the coalition by 41 to 18, with just 3 abstentions. And it was the Bolsheviks and the Menshevik internationalists, the left Mensheviks around Martov, voting against. Now, to maintain face, the compromisers demanded as their price for coalition that Milyakov's predatory foreign policy had to change. Guchkov had already resigned as war minister of his own accord. But now, on May the 2nd, in order to save the bourgeoisie, Milyakov, its recognised leader, was pushed out of the government, abandoned by the Democrats, the Allies and his own cadet party. And so the soldiers' demands for these 2 hated ministers to resign from April had actually been achieved. And Trotsky comments that Milyakov really did not deserve such cruel punishment, at least not from these hands. But the coalition demanded a purification sacrifice. In cutting off Milyakov, the coalition purified itself from the sins of imperialism. So Milyukov's attempt to push the revolution into a civil war, a war that would give the power back to the reaction, had failed. But since the compromisers didn't want to take the power, the road to compromise and coalition was the only one left after the April days. So the Petrograd Soviet formally endorsed the coalition at its meeting on May the 5th, which was also the day that Trotsky arrived back in Petrograd from Canada. And he spoke in the debate, warning that the double sovereignty is not destroyed, but merely transferred into the ministry, adding in conclusion 3 revolutionary articles of faith. Do not trust the bourgeoisie, control the leaders, rely on your own force. And Lenin, writing in Pravda after the coalition was formed, warned, May the 6th was a triumph for the bourgeoisie. The bourgeois government was on the verge of defeat. The bourgeoisie resorted to a skillful manoeuvre, in which the bourgeois began to do through the socialists what the bourgeoisie could never have done without them. And that's certainly not the only time in history that they have used lefts and left reformists in that way. Now, looking at the makeup of the government, Prince Lvov remained as premier of the new coalition, with Milyukov's place as Minister of Foreign Affairs now taken by the millionaire Tereshchenko. Now, the compromisers managed to wriggle out of taking full responsibility by only accepting 6 out of the 15 portfolios. Of the main well-known leaders, the social revolutionary Chernov became Minister of Agriculture, Kerensky the Minister of War, while Tseretelli took just the portfolio of Posts and Telegraphs to leave himself time for the EC. Another Menshevik, Skobelev, became Minister of Labour, while, to give supposed balance, a big Moscow industrialist, Konovalov, became Minister of Trade and Industry. In fact, as discussed in the next video, Konovalov soon resigned, unable to alter the ailing economy in the direction of his bourgeois friends. And Trotsky comments that Skobelov soon forgot his initial rhetoric against capitalist profit and settled down to the job of quelling strikes and restraining the workers. Again, not the first time that's happened. As Trotsky explains, in entering the coalition, the compromisers counted on a peaceful and gradual dissolution of the Soviet system. They imagined that the power of the Soviets, concentrated in their persons, would now flow over into the official government. The coalition government was to become a bridge to the bourgeois parliamentary republic. However, he explains, in a period of revolution, that perspective was impossible. The Soviets were not about to disappear. They were, despite their leaders, the fighting organisations of the oppressed classes, the classes with the real power in society. So, for example, the new city Dumas, although predominantly given Menshevik and social revolutionary majorities in the elections, were unable to take over power from the Soviets. Trotsky explains these municipal governments gave equal representation to all classes of the population, reduced to the abstraction of citizenship, and behaved in the revolutionary situation very much like a diplomatic conference, expressing itself in qualified and hypocritical language, while the hostile camps represented by it are feverishly preparing for battle. At the same time, the coalition government was in no hurry to set up a parliamentary regime in which the constituent assembly that they might elect would be dominated by non-bourgeois parties, just as the elected city Dumas were. The discussion about the electoral law for the assembly went on endlessly, deliberately never deciding on a date for elections. Now, while the masses discussed in the Soviets and the right wing organised in their own secret meetings, the coalition government continued as an impotent and hypocritical disguise for the dual power regime. The declaration of the new government amounted to very little, its only definite intention being to prepare the army for defensive and offensive activity to prevent the possible defeat of Russia and her allies. So much for changing war policy. Buchanan, the British ambassador, wrote, "The coalition government in Russia is for us the last and almost the only hope for salvation of the military situation on that front." Indeed, the Allied diplomats had every reason to be pleased with the efforts of Kerensky and Tseretelli to convince the army that an offensive would help bring peace. Kerensky toured the front to agitate in favour of the offensive, telling the soldiers that "you will carry on the points of your bayonets, peace." Gradually, the EC at the top became reconciled to supporting the offensive, formal support being given at the All-Russian Soviet Congress in early June. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, agitated boldly against both the offensive and the coalition government. Lenin, speaking at the June Congress, answered accusations that the Bolsheviks were in favour of a separate peace with Germany by saying, "We say no separate peace, not with any capitalists, and least of all with the Russian capitalists. But the provisional government has made a separate peace with the Russian capitalists. Down with that separate peace." Lenin explained in the pages of Pravda that the only way to arrive at a just peace was through a revolution, transferring power to the Soviets that could then make an appeal to the oppressed classes of other countries for peace without annexations and seizures. Workers could never believe such an appeal from a provisional government containing capitalists who by their very nature fight for robbery of lands and colonies. Lenin said, should the capitalists try to resist the peace, the oppressed classes of Russia and other countries will not shrink from a revolutionary war against the capitalists. Again, Lenin showed that the questions of peace and socialism were tied to the international revolution. This might not seem an easy solution, but as Lenin said in a speech on May the 14th, nothing but a workers' revolution in several countries can defeat this war. The war is not a game, it is an appalling thing, taking a toll of millions of lives, and it is not to be ended easily. Now, such a dual power regime couldn't possibly organise a strong military force at the front. Like the rest of society, the army was split on class lines, with a reactionary officer caste taken from the privileged classes and the mass of the soldiers from the oppressed classes. The soldiers' committees, created by Order Number 1, discussed previously, were, however, becoming filled with compromisers, and they were playing the same role as the Soviet leadership in trying to blunt the Soviets' revolutionary will. However, the majority of the commanding staff found themselves unable to impose their will on the revolutionary soldiers. Trotsky notes, looking ahead to the later civil war after the revolution, it was only possible either to take the commanding corps as it was from the nobility and the bourgeoisie, as the Whites did, the anti-revolutionary forces, or bring forward and train up a new one on the basis of proletarian recruiting, as did the Bolsheviks in the Red Army. The petty bourgeois democracy could do neither one thing nor the other. All they could do was to persuade, please and deceive everybody, and when nothing came out of it, turn over the power in despair to the reactionary officers and let them teach the people the correct revolutionary ideas. So Kerensky carried out endless and pointless changes in the top commanders, hastening, in fact, the breakdown of the army. Trotsky comments, "Compromism in a time of revolution is a policy of feverish scurrying back and forth between classes." Kerensky was the incarnation of scurrying back and forth. Placed at the head of an army, an institution unthinkable without a clear and concise regime, Kerensky became the immediate instrument of its disintegration. Now, the soldiers themselves certainly didn't want an offensive, and no threats from their commanders were about to change their minds. After all, nothing could be worse than death in the trenches. The mood was such that it seemed to the commanding staff that it only took one bold soldier to convince a whole regiment not to support the offensive. And many regiments did indeed declare that they would not fight. A delegation of patriotic social revolutionary soldiers from the Black Sea attempted to convince the Northern Front of the need for attack, but without success. On the other hand, a delegation from the Baltic Fleet travelled south and persuaded the Sevastopol sailors to disarm their commanders. The more the compromisers in the soldiers' committees attempted to convince the ranks of the offensive, the more their authority declined. A new note was sounded, Trotsky points out, when the commander of the 61st Regiment tried to frighten his soldiers with punishment at the hands of the government. One of the soldiers answered, "We overthrew the former government, we'll kick out Kerensky too." So it was clear to the commanding staff that the offensive would be a failure. As Trotsky wrote, the government could not decide on an immediate annulment of landlordship. That is the sole measure which would convince the most backward peasant that this revolution is his revolution. In such material and spiritual conditions, an offensive must inevitably have the character of an adventure. And the bourgeoisie themselves, while loudly agitating for the war, actually refused to put their money where their mouths were and supply the so-called Liberty Loan. Even some of the Allied commanders realised that the Russian army was hopelessly split. But still the Allies continued to push for the offensive, even threatening to stop military supplies if it didn't start soon. Because the offensive was being mounted for political reasons, not military ones, to turn the masses' interest to war and against revolution. The officers clung on to the desperate hope that an attack, perhaps even a few victories, would change the psychology of the ranks. And the offensive began on June the 16th on the southwestern front, the other fronts intending to join in soon after. Predictably, the offensive soon began to collapse, and the planned advances on the other fronts in July never really materialised. There were a few early successes against thin German lines that did raise morale at first, the soldiers feeling that this would strengthen Russia's negotiating position for peace. It also actually brought joy to the French stock exchange, as the socialist newspapers happily announced. But Trotsky noted wryly, those socialists were trying to estimate the stability of the revolution by the stock ticker. But history teaches that bosses feel better the worse it goes with revolutions. So actually, after a few kilometres advance, the Germans began to push the Russian army back again. Retreats and desertions began, and with the last hope of peace seemingly gone, the front collapsed. Trotsky says one of the companies refused even to toss a leaflet to the enemy, announcing the capture of Galich, until a soldier could be found to translate the German text into Russian so they knew what it said. In that it expressed the utter lack of confidence of the soldier mass in its ruling staff, both the old one and the new February one. He adds that the workers and garrison of Petrograd had never had any illusions in the offensive. The Vyborg Soviet, now completely dominated by the Bolsheviks, declared on June the 24th, "We protest against the adventure of the provisional government, which is conducting an offensive for the old robber treaties, and we lay the whole responsibility for this policy on the provisional government and the Menshevik and social revolutionary parties supporting it." So in fact, the offensive speeded the turn of the Soviets towards the Bolsheviks. The Soviet did adopt a resolution greeting the offensive on June the 20th, but by only 472 votes against 271, with 39 abstaining. Trotsky explains that the Bolsheviks, together with the left groups of Mensheviks and left SRs, constitute already 2/5 of the Soviet. This means that in the factories and the barracks, the opponents of the offensive are already an undoubtable majority. Soldiers dragged patriotic bourgeois demonstrators off the Nevsky and threatened them with being sent to the front. A machine gun regiment declared that it would go to the front only when the war shall have a revolutionary character, and that if anyone tried to disband them, they would disband the provisional government. These threatening tones were a clear sign that the masses were shifting to the left.